Morning, everybody. You're very brave to be here to discuss this very frightening topic at 10:30 in the morning. I was 9 during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I vividly remember it. And I told my mother that the dining room table we had was certainly not going to be strong enough to save us in the event of a nuclear explosion. And she said, "But it's made of mahogany. There's nothing stronger." And I said, maybe you should think of something better. And then I asked her why the garage wasn't full of cans of beans and other things that were going to sustain us during the inevitable nuclear winter that was going to follow. And she reassuringly said, "Don't worry, it will all be all right." She told me years later she was terrified. And until we saw those boats turning around, most of you are too young to remember this, on those small teeny black and white TVs we had at the time, the boats stopped and we knew we were okay. And but it was one of the most frightening episodes, I think, that I've ever lived through. So we're here this morning to discuss a serious life-threatening question which has been all but forgotten: nuclear war. As some of us are old enough to remember the missile crisis, the movie Oppenheimer, starring our own Cillian Murphy, reminded us of the genesis of these terrifying weapons. But we're now in a situation of growing danger. The so-called doomsday clock set by eminent atomic scientists every year is set at 90 seconds to midnight, the closest we have ever been to apocalypse. A durable end to Russia's war in Ukraine seems distant. And when I say durable, I mean Russia out of Ukraine, which is the only reasonable solution to that. And the use of nuclear weapons by Russia in that conflict remain a serious possibility. Nuclear spending programs in the 3 largest nuclear powers, China, Russia, and the United States, threaten to trigger a 3-way nuclear arms race as the world's arms control architecture collapses. Russia and China are expanding their nuclear capabilities, and pressure mounts in Washington for the United States to respond in kind. That's leaving out rogue players like North Korea. God knows what they might get up to. Meanwhile, other potential nuclear crises fester. Iran continues to enrich uranium too close to weapons grade while stonewalling the International Atomic Energy Agency on key issues. Efforts to reinstate an Iran nuclear deal appear unlikely to succeed, although depending on the result of the American election in November, fingers crossed and every other part of ourselves crossed that it won't be Mr. Trump. Nuclear expansion in Pakistan and India continues without pause or restraint. Dr. Patricia Lewis cannot forget about these pressing questions. She leads the International Security Programme at Chatham House in London. Previously, she served as Deputy Director and Scientist in Residence at the Centre for Non-Proliferation Studies at the former Monterey Institute of International Studies, Director of the UN Institute for Disarmament Research, and Director of the Verification, Research, Training and Information Centre in London. She was on Hans Blix's, do you remember Hans Blix? We used to be seeing on the news every night, on his 2004-2006 WMD Commission, the 2011 Advisory Panel on the Future Priorities of the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, and an advisor to the 2008-10 International Commission on Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. So that this is only a fraction of the things she has done and continues to do. So she is surrounded day and night by thoughts that we prefer to push to the back of our minds and has to deal with it on our behalf. To interview her this morning, we're delighted to welcome Professor Ray Murphy of the Irish Centre for Human Rights at the University of Galway. Professor Murphy has particular interests in peacekeeping and peace building and in international humanitarian law. He's on the faculty of the International Institute for Criminal Investigations and Justice Rapid Response. He was the EU Fundamental Rights Agency Senior Expert for Ireland, a member of the Executive Committee of the Association of Human Rights Institutes, and a Commissioner with the Irish Rights and Equality Commission from 2014 to 2019. He's a former member and Vice Chair of the Executive Committee of Amnesty International Ireland. He has also conducted training on behalf of the ICRC, No Peace Without Justice, Amnesty International, the UN, the International Institute for Humanitarian Law, and the Pearson Peacekeeping Centre in Canada. So 2 formidable individuals with tons of qualifications to tell you about this very pressing issue. Please welcome Dr. Patricia Lewis and Professor Ray Murphy.
So, good morning, everybody, and a special welcome to Patricia, who has taken the time and effort to come to Galway to share with us her scientific and other broader knowledge, and who has devoted much of her life to this particular critical issue. And before we came on this morning, we were just generally talking about the state of the world And we were talking, I suppose, about how the use of nuclear weapons is not a taboo subject anymore amongst the elite within the world, the leadership of the world. It may not be in the Irish Times, or the Independent, or whatever paper you happen to read, but there is now an emerging narrative, I think, and a change where many states are very ambiguous about the first use principle, that they're not saying that they will only use nuclear weapons as a last resort when they may be attacked by nuclear weapons. They're now actually modifying and compromising, and the lesson is the interpreting what they're saying is deliberately ambiguous. And I was really struck because the United States is the largest holder of nuclear weapons today, always has been. And in 2019, I think it was, President Trump and his administration in negotiations about nuclear disarmament made quite a profound change in the policy of the United States that has been changed again by Biden, but essentially saying, actually, they may use nuclear weapons as a first resort. And that was a narrative which today even continues to exist. And as was mentioned by Katrina at the outset, I found it very alarming when I was just doing a small bit of research that Trump's former security advisor, O'Brien, I think maybe Timothy O'Brien, he's advocating now with the United States that they increase their nuclear arsenal, that they increase their stocks of plutonium and other chemicals that are needed, and that they increase the stocks so that they will always have at least more than the combined strengths of both China and Russia put together. And he also has said that they should resume nuclear testing. And this is an extraordinary public statement that has been refuted by experts. It actually jeopardizes the security of the United States for a reason I won't go into, but it turns on its head much of what has been achieved at a very delicate time in international relations. So maybe, Patricia, you'd like to say something about US policy and some of those issues.
Sure. I mean, I'm going to talk about why we're so worried at the moment with what's going on in the world and where we are in terms of the nuclear weapons and their controls and how it all sort of fits together. But Ray, I'd love it if you kind of challenge me, ask me questions.
Sure.
And perhaps bring in some of the people in the room as well.
Yeah.
If you've got questions or you disagree with something I've said, I'd love to hear from you. So first of all, I think if we look at the Cold War, which we came out of in the late 1980s, early 1990s, that was probably the most dangerous period in human history in terms of the capabilities that we had to completely destroy not only humanity, not only our own species, but countless of other species as well. We went up to, on each side, Russia and America, they've pretty well always been neck and neck, around 30,000 warheads apiece. And each of those warheads, almost all of them were at least the size of those that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Many of them were much greater. Some of them were a bit smaller, but they still dwarf any conventional explosives we have today. They're not equivalent. When you hear about phrases like small or tactical nuclear weapons, or you hear about the neutron bomb, all of this is just nonsense. They are all really extraordinarily powerful nuclear weapons that do enormous amounts of damage. So during the Cold War, we were in this terribly dangerous situation in which we were sort of at trigger point. But we are heading back into that now without the shared understandings that were developed over the Cold War, without the rules that were developed between the nuclear weapon states during the Cold War. And we are gradually, as you said, eroding all of that fabric, all of that sort of edifice that sort of provides checks and balances. So, the whole concept of nuclear deterrence is that they're so awful, they're so terrible, that if you were to think about using them, you would know that it would come back at you, and therefore you would stay your hand. And the idea behind that then was that you wouldn't actually go into any sort of war for the possibility that it might go that far. And we're seeing all of that change now. They are thinking again about using battlefield nuclear weapons. For the first time since the Korean and also Cuban crises, we are having the overt threat of the use of nuclear weapons. That was from Putin. We also had, if you remember, a few years back, an exchange between Presidents Trump and Kim Jong-un over whose button was bigger, really, and who was going to, push fast. There was this kind of standoff. To the point then, I don't know if you remember the Hawaiian scare, when people in Hawaii were sent by accident, it turned out, a message on their mobile phones to take cover because of an incoming missile. And nobody at that time that I know of thought, oh, this is a mistake, because the tension was so high between them. So what we've learned is that risks are not static. You have a set of risks that we had in the Cold War. You had a much lessening of risk of nuclear use in the end of the Cold War, and a blossoming of rules and regulations and international treaties and confidence-building measures in that period. And then we kind of let it sort of peter out, and then relationships have gone sour again. We have a conflict. Russia invaded Ukraine. They invaded Ukraine in 2014, and then again in 2022. And this time, because they haven't done as well, they're threatening the use of nuclear weapons in the hope of terrifying all of us so that we pressure our governments to stop supporting Ukraine. And at the moment, I think we're calling their bluff. But you're right, there's more and more complexity. There's more ambiguity. There's less certainty. And the thing that we've also learnt is that during the Cold War, this wasn't published at the time, but we've been doing the research since, is that we had many instances of what we call near misses or close calls, where perhaps one or two people stood between the event that was unfurling and the use of nuclear weapons. There was, for example, in 1983, a wonderful man called Colonel Stanislav Petrov, who was a missileer at an early warning station. He saw incoming missiles from the United States into Russia. And it's a long story. There's a film made about it. The books, I'm sure there's a T-shirt. But if you read it, what you will understand is that he decided, and we'll all resonate with this phrase, he couldn't trust the computer. And so he decided to wait until he got actual sight when the sun rose. And that saved us all, because it turned out it was a computer error. There were other instances in the same year during the live-fire NATO exercise, Able Archer. We know of several instances in that which were very dicey. One in particular, because there was a belief amongst quite a lot of experts and military officers in Russia that this live-fire exercise was a facade for a real invasion. They actually mobilized nuclear weapons. Two US Air Force intelligence officers witnessed it, saw it, and decided not to report up. Because had they reported up, it would have escalated, or at least could have escalated. So we've been cataloguing these. Now, the question I have is, does Colonel Stanislav Petrov is his successor still in Russia? Is there somebody like him who has that logical thinking, that human thinking, to say, I'm not going to report this up, I'm going to assume it's a computer error unless I know more? Do we have that person in North Korea? Do we have that person in China? Do we have that person sitting on a US submarine somewhere out in the Pacific? Because that's what we have. That's our thin line between now and the use of nuclear weapons.
And you're referring to the instances that we are aware of. Like in Bob Woodward's book, the recent one on the Trump administration, Trump boasts that we were very close to nuclear war with North Korea at one stage. And he doesn't elaborate on how close we were, or we were aware that there were significant tensions. Publicly, Trump said that he used the words, they will meet with fire and fury, the likes of which the world has never seen before. Not especially helpful rhetoric in a tense standoff, we spoke before we came on about, I remember reading a book by a former US general about all the near nuclear accidents that almost occurred during peacetime that are not well publicized, that could have had catastrophic consequences for humankind. So it is a very worrying time, and it's one of the things as a lawyer, because I believe in international law, I believe in rules that should be abided by and the legitimacy of them. But we've seen a significant erosion of the framework governing disarmament and verification and reduction, to the extent that, for example, the Russians said they pulled out of the nuclear weapons ban, for example, the treaty that they wouldn't test.
Right. The test ban.
The test ban. And the START treaty will run out quite soon, 2026, I think. Yeah. There doesn't seem to be a framework in place to replace it. These are strategic weapons and verification mechanisms to ensure that people comply with them. And you need some degree of transparency. Of course, you can't believe what every state will tell you, but you must have some kind of objective verification system in place. Yeah. Organizations, I think, like the International Atomic Energy Agency have done great work over the years in actually fulfilling this role on behalf of all of us. Yeah. But that's being eroded also, and that's deeply troubling.
Yes, absolutely. And also, we have more nuclear weapon states now, or possessors. So we have the five, China, France, the UK, the United States, Russia. They coincidentally, and it's not actually connected or correlated or any causation, are also the permanent members of the Security Council. It's quite accidental in that sense. But we also now have India and Pakistan with nuclear weapons. You mentioned North Korea with nuclear weapons. We have the likelihood that Israel has nuclear weapons. They've never declared it. The only country that actually got rid of them was South Africa at the end of apartheid. And I think that the numbers have gone down. So you talked about all of the treaties. So the treaties began in the 1970s as a way of trying to get some curbing on the arms race. These were bilateral treaties. But prior to that, there's a treaty called the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And it was signed in the end in 1968. And within it is a clause that in exchange for countries agreeing not to develop nuclear weapons, they would get peaceful uses of nuclear energy if they wished it, including things like radiation treatment in hospitals and so on. It's not just about nuclear power. So very important for a lot of countries. But they would also demanded that the 5 nuclear weapon states, as existed then, would disarm, would get rid of their nuclear weapons. And that hasn't happened. But all of this, along with, you mentioned the test ban, New START, and prior to that START, etc., there were a whole sort of framework of bilateral, plurilateral negotiations and treaties with verification. So that's now brought from this sort of level of 30,000, 27,000, however you count. Russia at the moment has 5,500, roughly. These are estimates by the Federation of American Scientists, which are considered the most robust in the public domain. And these are robust because up until last year, Russia was reporting on the number of nuclear weapons it had through the New START treaty, and it suspended its participation. The US has just reported again, it's despite Russia deciding to suspend its participation, the United States is continuing to participate. The US now has 5,000, so we're down a lot. But 5,000 each is an enormous number still in terms of what these weapons can do. To give you a flavor of this overwhelming number of these two countries, France has 290. So Russia, the US, has 5,000 apiece. France has less than 300. The UK has 225. Those two are exact numbers. India, we estimate, have 160-ish. Pakistan, about the same, 170. North Korea, we don't know, maybe 20 to 30. Israel, we have no idea, maybe 0, maybe 70, maybe 270. That's the range of estimates. And China, which everyone's so worried about, at the moment has around 500, but it is increasing. It's the only nuclear weapon state that's really making some significant headway in increasing not only numbers, but also the range of platforms. But it's come from a very low number. It's a tenth of the number of the US and Russia each.
Yeah, isn't that alarming, though, that China is being made to be seen as the villain?
Yeah.
But actually, all of the nuclear states, they're all increasing their capacity. The British are upgrading their Trident, if you look at what Keir Starmer has said, we have a term here for something unrelated to nuclear weapons. It's the triple lock. But we
have as well.
Yes, you have for the nuclear deterrent
as well.
Yeah, for the nuclear deterrent. But I can't see any substantial difference between the Labour government's policy towards nuclear deterrent than that of the Conservative government. And you look at the United States, they are increasing their expenditure. They're committed to doing so. France is doing so. They're all committed to modernising and enhancing their nuclear deterrent. And at a time when actually, and then they're making China seem like the really bogey state, but actually China's nuclear, and I'm not saying that it's correct to increase its nuclear deterrent, but actually compared to the other states, such as United States and Russia, it's actually quite small. And I'm not justifying Chinese policy, but sometimes I can understand where the Chinese are coming from when they look at, and you should see nuclear expenditure in the broader context of expenditure on weapons and armaments. The United States spends about, I think the budget proposed for next year is about 850 billion. I mean, that is an extraordinary, obscene amount of money to be spending on any weapons systems.
And on weapon systems that you never intend to use. So I'm going to challenge you back, Ray, a bit on the issue, the word deterrent.
Yeah.
So one of the things that's happened in the UK, but it's all over, is that the word nuclear, the word weapons has got dropped. And they're calling it nuclear deterrent as a noun, not as a verb or an adjective or any other descriptor. And they, the word weapons has gone, but in the UK, the word nuclear's gone. So now they refer to Trident as the deterrent, as if nothing else might deter, which is obviously nonsense. And also the assumption that nuclear weapons deter is one I would challenge. So in order to have deterrence, you have to have credibility. So you have to be able to really make the other think that you might use this. And the problem with nuclear weapons is that the damage that gets done by nuclear weapons, I mean, we're talking in the immediate, we see immense radiation coming out straight away, enormous blast, heat, fires. So the whole of a city would be destroyed. And hundreds of thousands of people, possibly more, depending on the numbers in the city, would be killed in one single bomb. Imagine that now in several cities, and probably several bombs in several cities. And that makes the territory that you want to capture, say Russia decides to use one in Ukraine, then you can't move into that territory. You can't move your soldiers into a radioactive mess. You've also created a situation in which all of that has gone up into the atmosphere. You know the mushroom cloud shape, that's what it's doing. It's going up into the upper atmosphere. So it's spreading around to countries all around it with highly radioactive, very toxic substances that can stay in the ground, in the atmosphere, in the food chain for decades or more. Worse, when you get to around 100 nuclear weapons used in cities and you have a large amount of carbon put up into the upper atmosphere, it starts to spread around the globe. And even at that lowish number for a nuclear war, the calculations, which are very robust, and the more that we go into them, it gets worse. It's a bit like climate change, because they're the same model. We show that it affects sunlight for about 10 years, and there'd be global famine for about 10 years in, say, a war between India and Pakistan, or a war in Europe that use nuclear weapons. So people who are poor in far-flung places of the world, who are struggling as it is, will not be able to grow their own food because of a nuclear war in the Northern Hemisphere. That's what we're talking about here. So is this credible? Would you use such weapons? One of the interesting things, I think, is that when Putin made these strong threats, so in late 2022, there was enough worry in the US and European countries because there was an indication, or was believed to be an indication, that this threat to use nuclear weapons might be actually about to happen. And the way in which the US and France and Germany responded, along with China, it was a really interesting combination of countries, is that China went to talk to Russia and said, don't do this. Just don't do this, because once you do this, we can't support you anymore, really strongly. But the United States also, along with France, made a statement to the effect of, if nuclear weapons get used by Russia in Ukraine, in the first instance, we will not use nuclear weapons back. Now, that's a very positive thing, I think. Now, a lot of people have been very angry with the United States for saying this because they think it undermines nuclear deterrence. But actually, I think it was a fantastic communication. It was saying to the people of Russia, your government might be prepared to cross that line. We will withhold. We will respond, but it won't be nuclear. It would be something awful. It would be fire and fury, probably, but not necessarily nuclear.
Yeah. And sometimes I worry, though, that, can we rely on our governments to tell us the truth? No. Certainly there is a greater threat, I believe, from countries like North Korea, and you don't need to be that intuitive to understand how unstable somebody like Kim Jong-un is, and also if the deterrence of the nuclear threat there is more relevant because that's all they have, in a sense, if there is a significant if hostilities break out. But I'll always remember something I read, and this is about 40 years ago, and it was a book by, I think it was Arthur Schlesinger, on Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, president. And it was very praiseworthy of him. But one of the things that really struck me at the time and has always stayed with me is, in his election campaign, John F. Kennedy spoke about the nuclear gap between the Soviet Union and the United States. It was a fiction. The United States had superiority, but he alleged that it didn't. And when he came into power, he had to actually then increase US expenditure on nuclear weapons and expand its arsenal. And it was a major contributor to the then arms race. And I mean, John F. Kennedy was almost deified in Ireland, as a political leader. And I mean, he had some great points, but it's interesting that some, and so therefore, there's a double think about some nuclear weapons. I was reading, just about in the SIPRI, the recent SIPRI yearbook, and one of the ones that was quite striking that I never knew about the Israeli situation, because I think it was former President Carter actually publicly acknowledged that Israel had weapons, and a former Israeli general has publicly said so, but they've never confirmed it. But their official policy is, for example, that we will not be the first state to introduce nuclear weapons into the Middle East. Now, that to me is a great distortion of the reality on the ground, because there is there is evidence they already have them. But they interpret that as that we're not going to publicly say so, and some other things. So it's just the way that the game is played at certain political levels. And I'm also worried about the extent to which the major arms manufacturers and nuclear components manufacturers use lobbyists and financial means to influence think tanks, governments, and both say in the UK and France, to determine policy, which is in their interests, but not in the interests of national security, as I would perceive it to be, but pursuing particular agendas for their arms manufacturing and nuclear manufacturing components. Would you see evidence of that in the UK or France?
I think that the culture in the UK, France, and the US, and I would say in Russia, probably also in China, is such that you don't actually need to have that. It's already embedded. They see nuclear weapons as a vital part of the range of deterrence policies, systems, weaponry, etc. And they see it as a vital sort of backdrop. Each one of them has a different doctrine in terms of use, in terms of the position, the type of weapon that they have. But that's essentially the basics of it. So I don't think that they need to do, that they do have undue influence in that sense, because I think it's already so deeply ingrained.
Yeah.
And one of the problems that we have is that those countries that are trying to challenge us and undo it are struggling against that deeply ingrained belief system, which is pervasive through countries that don't have nuclear weapons. In NATO, for example, there's this sense that nuclear weapons provide this ultimate guarantee. And it's so hard, because how would you want to get rid of an ultimate guarantee? How would you want to get rid of something that deters? So the question is, you have to keep asking, does it? Does it deter in every single situation you can think of? Of course not. No weapon could. No single weapon system could possibly do that. Why would nuclear weapons be that different? So I think that we need to start challenging that more. We need to start looking at the risks involved in terms of accidental use, inadvertent use. We need to look at the taboo of use. You mentioned China. China and India for a long time have had what's called a no first use policy. They also have no use against non-nuclear weapon states policy, so they would never use it. But then most of the weapon states have that too. But they have a no first use policy, which is actually, you can see on the ground, is real, in that the warheads and the missiles are separate. That's changing as China goes into more submarine. You can't have nuclear warheads and missiles separate on a submarine very easily, right? And it wouldn't make that much difference. So that starts to shift and change, but the policy still exists. The NATO doesn't like this because they want a more flexible policy. They want to be able to, because of the Cold War, have a response against overwhelming conventional force. But that ship has sailed. We are not in that situation at the moment. Russia doesn't have the capability of overwhelming conventional force. And I think as well that, there are a number of ways in which you can structure treaties so that in the case of force majeure, as it's called, a crisis, a major international crisis, then the treaty essentially no longer applies, or there are parts of it that no longer apply. I know there are lawyers in the audience. I know some of them personally, so please correct me on this. But I think that we need to be more creative. I'd like to give a real shout out to Ireland here. So Ireland was the instigator, the creator of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty back in the early 1960s, and has been seen ever since as the true guardian, if you like, of the treaty. So we have the three nuclear weapon states, the US, Russia, and the UK, as the depositories of the treaty. And they have this sort of guardianship as a result. But the true guardian is often seen as Ireland. And Ireland then went on to be a main player for this new treaty, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which prohibits all nuclear weapons in the way that chemical weapons and biological weapons have been prohibited, and landmines and cluster munitions. And they've been prohibited on the basis of international humanitarian law and human rights law. And I think that this is a really interesting framework for us to start thinking about these weapons. Because why would, if you look at the inhumaneness of weapons, and we've banned completely biological weapons on that basis, chemical weapons on that basis, why wouldn't we ban nuclear weapons on that basis? Because they are even more inhumane than those weapons, right? Mm. So this is the way Ireland has been pushing, along with a number of other countries, and this treaty has been growing. I co-chair the scientific advisory group for the treaty, so we're trying to really develop a scientific basis for a lot of the way in which the treaty is structured, and I'm probably going too far into it right now, but this is the sort of the root of international law. And I think our problem now is that international law itself is being undermined.
Absolutely. And I mean, we need only look at for example, the recent consequences of Brexit for the official policy of the then Conservative government was that they could violate international law. It was acceptable to do so, and they're threatening to pull out of some other major international treaties, human rights treaties, that they in fact were major instigators of and were central to the creation of these. So, I mean, international law. We look at conflicts in Ukraine and Gaza to see how international law has very little impact, but. I remember many years ago having a discussion, quite a heated discussion, with an American professor in a public forum who said that international law has now changed as a consequence of certain actions taken by the United States. And I said, no, the law hasn't changed. Just because somebody violates the law doesn't mean that it has changed. The law exists. This is the framework. And if you violate it, you are a potential war criminal. And I've always, even from a very young age, when I began to think about these things, I could never understand how anyone could ever justify the possession and potential use of nuclear weapons because of their catastrophic consequences. There's no possibility whatsoever of distinction. There's no possibility of taking precautions. There's no, as you pointed out, the immediate medium-term and long-term consequences are too horrific to even contemplate. And why states continue to push the agenda of the nuclear deterrent and possession of these is anathema to me. And I'm glad you acknowledged, because I was going to say it, but I didn't like to be too parochial about Ireland's role. And sometimes I think we do overestimate our role in the international theatre. But in this case, no. We were central to it, and we remain so. And it shows how important a role a small state can take on certain issues. And when we were in the Security Council, it further developed, for example, the gender dimension of disarmament and nuclear weapons, which was something that wasn't really acknowledged or fully appreciated up to then. So we can do something, we have done something. One of them, now it's a complex issue, but one of the many reasons why we're not members of NATO is because of the NATO nuclear umbrella.
You wouldn't be allowed in NATO.
Well, that's good to know. Anyway, so would anybody like to ask a question? We've dominated it up to now, but I'm conscious. Yes, please. Yeah.
Do we have maybe a microphone?
Maybe you just, it's a small enough theatre, so if you speak up.
Just for the recording?
For the recording,
sure, okay.
You do need to wait, if you don't mind.
Yeah, there's one
I have
there.
a mic here. Does somebody want to come and take this off me? Switch it off. Have you got one? Okay, cool.
No, I just wanted to say that you were saying about NATO. But the reason we're not in NATO is because of Northern Ireland, because Frank Aiken was the foreign minister in Ireland at the time, and he fought in the Irish Civil War, and there was no way he was going to. He actually said to the Americans, "We'll join as long as you can get the British to leave Northern Ireland."
What I said was one of the many reasons.
One of the many reasons.
No. And I fully acknowledge what you say is politically quite true. But, I mean, the government is on record of saying that is one of the reasons why we're not contemplating joining NATO. And it would be inconsistent with our foreign policy over many decades.
But I do also think it is It is pertinent because, one of the things that people say, oh, Ireland's a small state, it doesn't have nuclear weapons, why does it have it? It shares a border with a nuclear weapon state, right, at the moment.
Yeah.
I mean, contested, but nonetheless. And so I think that, there's any nuclear war, Ireland will not be immune from its effects.
No. And somebody in the audience can contradict me or correct me if I'm wrong on this. After the Chernobyl disaster, which in terms of what nuclear war could, it would be a minor incident in terms of
a drop in the ocean.
For a period, we couldn't consume and we couldn't export our sheep from the west of Ireland because of cesium in the grass and soil that was absorbed into the food chain.
Yeah.
So, and that was like a minor blip in terms of potential nuclear consequences. Can you just imagine the long-term consequences of a real nuclear war? And you mentioned something, and you were in the middle of your stride. Now I forget what it is, but there was one thing I wanted to, because in the 1970s we had the mutual assured destruction policy. Not us, but it existed. But for a time, there was advocated that maybe there could be a limited nuclear war on the European continent. And this, of course, was not especially welcomed by the Germans in particular and the French. But it's the idea, and it's actually out there again, that it is possible to have a limited nuclear war, use tactical warheads that could achieve a military purpose, and that thereafter we can all carry on as if nothing has changed. And that is a total fallacy and distortion of the scientific reality of any type of nuclear weapon. And I mean that there is, and it still emerges from time to time. Like you mentioned something that I read that you had written, actually, Patricia, about relatively recently a junior minister in the Israeli cabinet advocated the use of a limited nuclear warhead in Gaza. Now he was dismissed from the government, but it's actually, like, for months since then, policymakers and others, commentators, have continued to discuss this in the broader context of Gaza. And for anybody that's spent any time in the Middle East, I mean, this is such a small area. Everything is so close to each other. It's like Ireland and the UK. If anything happens to the United Kingdom, the idea that we're going to be shielded from it is unfortunately not something that you can
and this
rely
then
upon.
You get then a cascading effect, of course. So once one country starts making those sorts of threats, other countries in the region, for example, Iran, that those in Iran who are pushing to have nuclear weapons, there are always in each country those that push against and those that push forward. And that's been true in lots of countries that might surprise people, including Australia and Italy and Switzerland, for example, over the years. Sweden. All fair play to Hans Blix, thank you for that. But I think that, you start, this ratchets up and gives more voice to the forces in each country that want to develop nuclear weapons. Saudi Arabia will have those voices as well. South Korea has those voices. So, this is the trouble. It might just be rhetoric, almost definitely just rhetoric, but it helps then push and proliferate and increase that whole kind of temperature. In the Cold War as well, they had all sorts of very weird, fanciful ideas of things like the ladder of escalation. I don't know if you remember that. And this is an idea that if I fired a small one at you, you'd understand the message, right? The message would be, it's just a small one, you're okay, that's it. And then if you fired a small one back, then I could interpret that as, okay, that's kind of evens. Or I might say, oh, hang on a minute, that hit a different target. That's an escalation, so I'm going to fire another back to give another message, which is stop now, because it's going to get worse. But you might interpret that as, oh my God, that's the first in a salvo of something else, and fire a whole load. This was called the ladder of escalation. These are the people in charge. These people thinking like this. We laugh at Kim Jong-un, but actually people were thinking like this during the Cold War in these very so-called sensible countries. I'm just putting it out there that perhaps these aren't the people who should be running the show.
you might have already answered this, but I still can't wrap my head around the psychology for if it will be 10 years of the whole world not being able to survive in the way that right now that we are surviving now. What is the psychology behind why would you even want to? Because even if you did launch it somewhere else, the whole world globally would be devastated. So what is the point for wanting to even do it to somebody else when you would be then impacted as well?
Well, this is the heart of the question. This is where this is the point. Nobody in their right minds, there are always people not in their right minds, and some of them are in charge, but nobody in their right minds would want this, right? Absolutely correct. So that's why people believe they deter. Because if you think that that's what might happen as a result of your actions, then you won't do it. So if you, say you're President Putin, you're thinking about using a nuclear weapon because you're not doing very well on the conventional forces side, and you're getting frustrated and you want to show who's boss. But if you think, well, that will unleash a whole series of events that could end up with this terrible, catastrophic situation for Russia, for everywhere, then you might say, oh, well, I won't do that first step. That's nuclear deterrence. Now, it's a hugely risky thing, because what if somebody miscalculates? What if somebody misinterprets? What if somebody thinks there are missiles coming in when they're not? And we've got lots of instances through history. And so far, we've been lucky. And that's the best analysis I can give you. We have been lucky. And so can we rely on that luck? It's a hell of a thing to have to rely on. And a lot of it depends on being lucky in our leadership, having the type of leaders who'll say, you know, we'll go this far, but actually in the end, like Kennedy, you know, we will have back channels. We will be doing everything we can to stop this. We have had those leaders, but I'm not sure that we can rely on having those leaders forever. And it's quite clear in some countries that have these weapons that those leaders are not necessarily the type of leaders that we had before. So I think we're in a really difficult situation. But I don't want everyone to come away from here feeling despondent and terrified, because there are things we can do, right? We have tried and tested techniques as to how we can prevent this. So I think that's where we need to be focusing. But I think a lot of people feel that disempowered, and they feel that lots of things have been tried and failed, which is always true in everything. Any engineers in the room? Yeah? So you know what I'm talking about? Any musicians in the room? You know, again, any artists who've perhaps painted something and then thought, that's not good, I'll try a different way. You know, everyone knows about that. So I think that, you know, when you think about, well, you know, we've tried all of this, but it hasn't worked. Well, maybe it didn't work because of the context, or maybe it didn't work because there was a little piece missing that we needed to put in. There's all sorts of things. So just having things not worked before, or having worked and then not worked, doesn't mean that they can't be fixed. No. So we need to get busy. Ireland is ratcheting up. It is doing an extraordinary amount of work, as much as it possibly can, with a very small team on the international stage, and punching way above its weight in that regard with other countries. New Zealand would be one, for example, South Africa, Austria. You know, I think that Mexico, fantastic country in this regard. You know, I think there are lots and lots of countries who are doing great work, and they work together, and they're really pushing and pushing and pushing. It doesn't make the papers here very often. It doesn't make the news. The trials and tribulations make the news, not the progress. So.
I think we're chairing the disarmament conference right now, June, July and August. Yeah. I don't know.
In Geneva.
In Geneva. I didn't know this till I just was doing a little bit of research for today myself, and that sometimes we don't get the message out.
No.
But one of the things that bothers me is how closely interrelated everything is. For example, like President Trump is challenging United States commitment to Taiwan, military commitment, and to South Korea. Now that's, for South Korea, that actually poses a potential threat in that they feel threatened by North Korea, so they may now consider the need for nuclear weapons because they can't rely on the nuclear umbrella provided by the United States, whether you agree, think it's a good or a bad idea. And it's just the interlinkage between all these issues. But it was the thing actually that you said in the middle of a broader statement that I wanted to take up because it's something I think it's important. We're talking about nuclear weapons, but you must see this in the broader context of just armaments. Yeah. And you had said like Russia today does not pose a threat to the conventional forces. The combined European forces within NATO are more than adequate. It's not a personal opinion, are more than adequate to deal with any military threat from Russia.
Yeah.
And that's even without the United States. But you'll still find the dominant narrative is that you must increase military expenditure to 2%. And above
2.5.
Yeah, 2.5, sorry. And some states are spending
3.
more. And, I want to challenge that because that's where this all leads. It's the constant need to increase armaments, increase nuclear deterrence or whatever, and then the other side looks at you and perceives you as a threat. And I think that's something that we as a country can advocate for because the way I see it, okay, we're not going to join NATO, but I do personally see a militarization within the European Union, which bothers me. And I don't have, I'm ex-military myself and I'm quite proud of my record in the Defence Forces, but I'm very skeptical about those that advocate further and further military expenditure to enhance security, because I think time and again that's proven to be a false narrative that only increases the tensions and incentives by the so-called perceived threats and enemy states to increase theirs. And it's not that significant in some ways, but China and the United States were in negotiations about nuclear reductions and controls. But they now have broken off because of United States commitment. China has suspended it because of United States commitment to supplying weapons to Taiwan. Yeah. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm just saying how all these things are so interlinked and so delicate, and the potential consequences for sometimes not challenging dominant narratives of major states. And I'm still not wholly convinced that the major arms manufacturers, and like if the arms manufacturers, the nuclear and other arms manufacturers spent 120 million in lobbying in the UK and France alone, I still think that has to have some impact. I can see, but that it isn't. And therefore, it was former president and commander of the Allied forces back in the 1940s and 50s, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, warned us about the industrial military complex. Well, the industrial military nuclear complex, we need to be aware of its existence. And as a state and as individuals, we have a role. Sean. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you.
We need a microphone.
Yeah, just hang on for the mic. Hang on for the mic, Sean.
Make sure it's on.
There's a man behind.
Okay. I just wanted to pick up on two words each of you used. Ray used the word the dominant narrative.
Yeah.
And you used the word the back channels. And I've spent a long time in different difficult environments, and I've always found myself in a situation trying to interpret what the actual narrative is. That the public statements that are made by Trump, Biden, Netanyahu, whoever, that's part of the roadshow. What's really happening, that's, let's say, the dominant narrative. What's really happening in the back channels, behind the scenes, maybe we got some glimpses of it in WikiLeaks or whatever, but there's a huge gulf between the two. And I think that that's, for all of us, you know, when we're trying to listen to day-to-day stuff, try to figure out what's real and what's fiction, and what's for a particular audience and what's for another audience, an American audience, Jewish audience, an Irish audience, whatever. So they're the two words that I picked up on. If, you know, the back chat or back channels, I think it's very, very significant.
Very, yeah.
If
And
you could make some comments on those.
absolutely, I think, and by their very nature, need to be out of the public eye. And we don't know always what's going on. I think the most important thing is that they do exist. You mentioned the Conference on Disarmament. The Conference on Disarmament hasn't achieved anything since 1996 with the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. But having that venue in Geneva and having all of the states that are working on these issues at that venue, and also in the Biological Weapons Convention meetings there, in the landmines meetings there, means that there are senior diplomats talking to each other. Now they're making statements, but they're also having a little coffee in the coffee bar, maybe a cheeky drink after work, and they are talking in a very different way. They have personal relationships. They learn to trust each other on a personal basis. Messages can be sent back that can be trusted to a degree, that fits in. A large part of it is a form of intelligence gathering, but in a benign way. And it's about forming those relationships. And sometimes it's those that we know from our own research that have helped save us. That deeper understanding, if you like, that interpretation of what the public statements are, which are, as you rightly say, often designed for a particular audience. And in today's world, they resonate in so many different audiences, and then they are interpreted perhaps completely wrongly as a result. So, yeah.
Thank you for a very interesting discussion. I'm much struck by what Ray said about arming and the way countries arm at the moment. And I suppose the world looks like a very different place from Ireland than it does from Central and Eastern Europe. I think the threat, obviously February 2022 was seismic for border countries. So you have a range of border countries. Sweden and Finland immediately joined NATO. So the threat in Central and Eastern Europe is immediate and pervasive. And the fall of communism in these countries, it's taken a while for these countries to recover from communism, and they haven't fully recovered yet psychologically. But I think there is an absolute determination in most of them never to go back. So for them, it's existential. And I think when you talk about increasing spending on arms to 2%, they want to go higher because it's an existential threat. And existential for them is very meaningful. When you have refugees coming across the border immediately, when you have Moldova and the threat to Moldova, you have, and in the Black Sea region generally, but also in that Eastern Europe, you have an existential threat. So I think we can be very comfortable in Ireland, in the Mid-Atlantic, in our relations, and how we view the world from this Western-centric viewpoint. We live in a multipolar world. We had the Cold War. We had the UN, we had our multilateral relationships, and we had the respect for international law. I think the last 5 to 10 years has shown that there isn't a respect for international law across a range of countries, and particularly powerful countries. What nuclear does is give countries status. We've seen that with North Korea, which would be an absolute backwater if they didn't have a nuclear arsenal. So you have these kind of things building in a multipolar world, and we have to navigate our way through that. And that's extremely difficult when you have the first threat of nuclear use was by Putin. and you have to have a Western response. And that is a threat that actually terrifies people, because Russia in Mariupol, in Kharkiv, in Homs, in Chechnya, have shown that they go for mass destruction. They don't do survivors. So we live under a real threat in Europe. It's absolutely, there was an estimate given very early in the war by people who know of a 5-year war in Ukraine. We're 2 years in. So this is long term, and it's much more, and for Europe, Ukraine is the threat.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
And there's a man at the back. Just one quick response before I go to the man at the back. I fully accept what you say and the perceived threat by Estonia, Latvia, Poland and all those states, but I'd ask you to consider the threat perceived by Russia of the continuous encroachment by NATO across, I don't agree. Well, you're not, you see, but anyway, let the man at the back have his say, whoever he is, or there's a person.
My question is, with AI now and potential simulated attacks that will appear absolutely credible and real, has that moved the dial closer than 90 seconds, or will it move the dial closer than 90 seconds to midnight?
Okay, and maybe I'll ask the woman here, just raise your hand and get the mic here. There's a person here. Sorry.
Hi, I suppose it's just about harking back to what you said, Patricia, about world leaders who may not be as sane as we would like them to be, and just to think about for a moment the elephant in the room, for want of an analogy, about Trump and how can we take what gives us comfort if Trump is elected and there is a spat, if we say, that may inspire him to use nuclear weapons, and how can we be sure that won't impact on the whole democracy of America?
Okay, we'll take a few more before we go.
I'm happy to take a few more.
Yeah,
It's up to
okay.
you entirely. 5
5
minutes.
minutes,
we
okay.
have, yeah.
To be quick, so please, yeah.
Okay.
Hi, I'm just wondering, in the context of all of this, given the impact of each individual weapon, why does any country feel the need to have 5,000? I mean, the world would be obliterated, like you would imagine, long before that. And why, if we're talking about we're relying on rational thought and common sense and stuff, why does any government believe that they need that much in the context of presumably in every country competing interests like education, health, infrastructure, whatever? Like, how does the bill even get passed? We've 3,000, we need more.
The person behind you, just breathes it.
Just a quick question in relation. Is it on? Yeah. A quick question. Pick up on something that Patricia said in relation to a story that was maybe not picked up by the media. And my question is, what role do you think that the media, how do you view that the role that the media are playing at the moment in terms of the crises across the world versus the role the media should be playing in the crises across the world, given that we're obviously very informed, very concerned in relation to what is happening in the world at the moment, but there is an enormous amount of people who have no clue, who it's not reported generally in the media. It's reported with a particular narrative in the media, and in terms of how we could make people more aware of the threats that are in the world and what we can do in order to raise awareness and maybe from a grassroots level up in terms of bringing pressure to governments in terms of what we want from them, what we need them to do. I think the media have a critical role to play in that, and I'm not happy that they're doing that correctly.
Okay, I think might be is there any last contributor?
One final question. You mentioned
just wait for the mic, just for a sec.
He's
you
got
have
the mic.
Matt. Okay, sorry,
Speak up.
apologies.
I just have one question. You mentioned the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it reminded me of something I read before, that Kennedy gave a lot of his advisors a copy of The Guns of August. I think it was a Barbara Tuchman book about the descent into World War I and how nations didn't expect it to descend so quickly and basically evolve into a complete disregard for humanitarian law and all that. I'm just wondering how similar do you think it is nowadays after a long peace, kind of globally speaking, between major powers? How similar a moment is it to prior to World War I? Because that's what kind of keeps me up at night, how quickly things could descend. Thank you.
Okay. Patricia, maybe the last word.
all fantastic questions, let me just say. Thank you so much. And I don't have the answers to everything at all. And that's actually part of my communication, is that no one has all the answers. And everyone has different versions of the truth. You pointed out, I think, very succinctly, extremely well, the vision from Poland, for example, from Moldova, where it's a visceral sense of fear of Russia and Putin. And I would say that, increased spending on conventional defense may well stave off the need for a push for more nuclear weapons. I would like us to look more as well at societal resilience. We've seen, for example, we're in a constant cyber war. Ireland is as much as anyone else, right? We have constant cyber attacks, partly because Ireland has so many IT companies and is storing so much information that you're now at the front line of cyber attacks, along with almost every other European country. Well, what's happened is that we've built up our resilience to these attacks. Yes, they get through. They get through all of our great. Everyone here has good password hygiene, right? But they get through it in the end. We don't click on fishes. No one here's ever clicked on fish. But they get through. But we've learned how to deal with them. We've learned how not to panic. We've learned, and we need to do that in other spheres as well. It seems to me we need, for example, all of us need to be trained in first aid. All of us need to be trained in, flood defences. We're talking about nuclear here, but we've also got extreme weather heading our way. We need more resilience in our societies, and we need to spend some of our defence spending on defence resilience. We really do. We need to learn from Finland. And while I talk about learning from Finland, let's learn from Finland and Norway and Sweden on how to deal with Russia. So Norway is a part of NATO. But Norway, when it joined NATO, was very aware that it had a border with Russia, and it was the first time any country had a direct border with Russia that joined NATO. Now, NATO doesn't go out looking for countries, by the way. Countries apply to join NATO. So that's really important to understand. Of course, there are all sorts of interesting back-channel conversations, but countries apply to join NATO for fear, for reasons of fear. And collective defence. And the only way to deal with a bully is collective defence. So NATO was, do you remember in the 90s? I mean, NATO, everyone was saying NATO is dying. Thank you, Putin, because it's created NATO's cohesion in a way that I've never seen NATO since the Cold War. It's increased NATO's importance. So what I think Norway did was very interesting. First of all, it said no NATO troops on Norway territory and infrastructure, and no nuclear weapons. And that helped Russia not see Norway as a potential invasion point. So if we're looking at ways in which NATO can kind of reduce its threat perception to Russia, the security dilemma that you quite rightly pointed out, that you build up your defenses to defend yourself, but not realizing the other side sees those as a threat, and that's a classic security dilemma. So, but there are ways in which you can do it. And one of those ways, of course, is arms control and verification and confidence building measures and the back channels. That's all those ways that we need to do that. So if you're going to talk about the 2%, the 2.5%, I want to hear arms control in there. I want to hear confidence building measures in there, threat reduction measures. They have to be in there as well. It's part of the deal, I think. So AI, if we get AI into nuclear command and control systems, I think we'll either have nuclear war very quickly or we'll get nuclear disarmament very quickly. Because it will be a mess. Either AI will decide in its infinite wisdom that it needs to get rid of these, or people will go, oh my God, let's get rid of them quickly now because we can't do anything else. Or we will start to see some really stupid decisions being made. These decisions should not be left to machines. They can't make. And it's also about accountability. You can't have a machine making a decision to kill a single individual, let alone a whole society. So Putin as a threat, in terms of nuclear weapons. I just wanted to say again how important China is in this, and China's attitudes towards nuclear weapons. And I think it's a great pity that China has suspended this. There are talks about talks, really. They're not yet on the arms control level. But I'm hopeful that after making that statement, they'll come back to it. Because I think it's so important that China helps us put the brakes on some of these things. And everyone talks about the complexity, which is true, of bringing in a third body. Sorry, that's a physicist talking, a third party. But if you, actually that could be really helpful, because Russia needs China. America needs China. Europe needs China. China needs us, right? All of us. So let's see if we can find a way to ratchet down the temperature a bit on all of this. And then I think someone mentioned the status of nuclear weapons, that nuclear weapons give status, and I think that is part of the problem. And it's certainly true for, you know, a country like North Korea. It's certainly true for, definitely true back in the day for India and Pakistan, and so on. And then the role of the media, finally. I mentioned the New York Times. I think if you go back and read the New York Times, I think it is free per view. I don't think it's one of those behind a paywall. And they've been doing a series of really excellent articles. It is very American. It is the New York Times, but it's nonetheless a very, very good series of articles on the issue of nuclear weapons. And connected in some way with this, and I think also with the Oppenheimer film, Annie Jacobson, she's a well-known defense writer in the US. She's brought out a book called Nuclear War, A Scenario. It is on audiobooks. I don't recommend it as bedtime reading, even though her voice is very soporific. But it has a scenario, and she's done a huge amount of research in a scenario in which North Korea sends a nuclear missile over to the United States, and what happens as a result of that. I won't spoil the thrill of the ride for you, but it's really, really worth. It's just a single scenario. There are many other potential scenarios, but she goes through it minute by minute as to what happens. So it's really worth reading. It's coming up for a lot of prizes already. It was just released earlier this year, so I'd recommend reading that.
Could I grab a mic from somebody just for a moment? There we go. Thank you so much. That was amazing, and I wish you were running the world, Patricia, because we'd all feel much more secure at night. And Ray, thank you so much for a brilliantly prepared interrogation and set of opinions of your own, which were really interesting to hear. One thing we didn't get to discuss was civic society response. Yeah. I'm old enough to remember the CND in Greenham Common and like large public protests about disarmament. There's no reason why those couldn't happen again. And I think that really matters, that ordinary people's opinions on this talk is part of attempting to raise consciousness about all of this so we all are better informed. We need more of this. We need more of a program of information about what's going on with people like yourself telling us what the facts are. There was a movie that was made, I think in the 60s, called, I think it was The Day After, was the name of it. And it had a cataclysmic effect on everyone. It was just a scenario where a bomb drops on a city, and what happened? And, you know, we forget the euphemistic stuff that's going on now that Patricia so eloquently described, the deterrent. When you look at someone just shattering into a million pieces in 2 seconds, even though it's simulated, you get some notion of how shocking and dreadful these weapons are. And maybe that might waken people up again. If none of you have seen it, it's on YouTube. Get everyone to watch it so that we all know what we're talking about, what this thing actually does. I suppose Oppenheimer, to some degree, did start to raise, but it's Cillian Murphy, who everybody thinks is gorgeous, because he is gorgeous. He's from Cork. Okay.
Brilliant.
Just before we let our two guests go, I want to let you know there are tickets still for 2 other events today. One, what's going to be a very lively discussion on RTE. I'm sure you're all fed up watching Oireachtas committees and grandstanding politicians and all the rest of it. I'm hoping the words Ryan Tubridy won't be mentioned, but you never know. That's at 2 o'clock this afternoon. And tomorrow morning we have Professor Mary Donnelly, who's head of the Climate Change Advisory Council here in Ireland, to tell us about the state of climate change, not least the fact that data centres are consuming 21% of all of our electricity and what we can expect to do about that. So please join me in giving a warm round of applause to Ray Murphy.